listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Welcome to the Decisive Podcast, brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're going to be talking about our Maritime Shadow Fleet report. Here with us to discuss the report is Ines Nastali, Senior Supply Chain Analyst at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Thanks for joining us today, Ines, and welcome to the Decisive.
Thank you, Kristen. Very happy to be here and talk about this very important, very topical subject.
Yeah. I'm excited to dive into it with you. No pun intended. Let's start with the basics. Can you provide a brief overview of what the Shadow Fleet is and how it's evolved since the introduction of the oil price cap?
Yeah, for sure. So if we start at the beginning, the oil price cap was introduced on the 5th of December 2022, and it's a measure to basically curb Russian oil exports following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the term Shadow Fleet kind of emerged following this introduction. Refers to a group of oil tankers that basically operate outside what you would call the traditional regulatory framework. They often are sanctioned tankers, and they evade those sanctions or restrictions that have been imposed by them by different governments and institutions. And since the introduction, the fleet has definitely evolved in several ways. We've seen an increased activity as traders and companies seek to circumvent these sanctions and continue to trade oil at prices above the cap. So the cap is $60 per barrel. This has led to a rise in the number of vessels operating outside the traditional shipping routes and regulations. Operators of those shadow fleet, they have diversified their shipping routes to less conventional paths to transport oil. That, for example, includes rerouting shipments to countries that are less likely to enforce the price cap or those sanctions. Especially what we see here is destinations of India or the UAE. And other issues that come with that, with the shadow fleet, is that these tankers are often older vessels that may not meet modern safety and environmental standards. These vessels are cheaper to operate because of the way they are flagged, the way they're owned, and they are therefore then used to transport oil discreetly, or they're trying to transport oil discreetly. And we've seen a few incidents already that I think we're going to talk about in a minute as well. Well, this is a development that we've seen over the past 3 years, I want to say. And so as the shadow fleet has grown, so now, especially as of this year, so has the scrutiny from governments and organizations monitoring oil trade. There are more sophisticated tracking technologies being employed to identify and monitor those vessels.
Thanks for that overview. It's really helpful to set the scene. You mentioned just now that the shadow fleet has grown. To the best of our knowledge, how many vessels are in the shadow fleet?
Yeah, that's right. So via research into the shadow fleet, S&P Global Market Intelligence and Commodity Insights colleagues, together we estimate that the shadow fleet includes 940 tankers. This number is comprised of 520 sanctioned tankers, whereby we've only looked at tankers that are above 27,000 deadweight, and 420 tankers that have what we call an opaque ownership. So these only includes vessels that previously were owned by a Russian individual or company, or had a registration in Russia, or ships that are more likely to be involved in sanction activity or with a fleet of sanctioned tankers.
And how do these vessels manage to evade sanctions on the movement of oil and its refined products, Ines?
Yeah, so one way to keep track of ships is via AIS. That's an automated signal that ships send out regularly to send their position, basically. And this is, of course, used for safety reasons, but it also allows for tracking a vessel position. You can, however, turn that AIS signal off. For example, where we've seen somewhat justified reasons in the past year or so is when ships are traversing the Red Sea due to the Houthi attacks. We've seen that, for example, even insurance or even some sanction authorities recommend turning off the AIS signal while traversing the Suez Canal to avoid attacks on ships. But in our case, from studying AIS data on our seaware product, we can see that 80% of sanctioned ships regularly turn off their AIS signal. So what happens when they do that? They are at sea and they then use ship-to-ship transfer of oil. So that can be normal as well. So when we see this on our AIS platform, that's not necessarily something illegal that's happening. Ship-to-ship transfer of products happens when a ship is bunkering. That's how ships refuel. But what happens, that goes often, one ship is used to supply another ship with fuel. But what happens in the case of the shadow fleet is that they are transferring oil that's come from Russia, so from a sanctioned ship to a less nefarious one, to then ship oil to Asia. So that's mainly why those ships don't want to be tracked and found. And that's in the end then how they manage to evade sanctions. They don't call at ports, for example. They are also, sanctioned ships are not allowed to call, for example, at European ports. So that is one way. What the other thing that we see that's happening is it is possible to transmit a different location that the ship is actually not in. You would then need satellite data or even people on location to prove that the ship is actually elsewhere. So you can broadcast, that is called spoofing. You can broadcast a location that the ship is actually not in. It might be spoofed to show a completely different location. Even sometimes when this goes wrong, you sometimes even see ships hovering over a land mass. So there's definitely something going on. And then the other thing that we see is, there's interesting terms being coined, right? Like the shadow fleet, and the other term that's been coined is zombie ships. So we even see zombie ships emerge. That is another tactic to avoid following these ships. That is when a ship that has been recycled, it doesn't exist anymore. And then one ship in the shadow fleet takes on the IMO number. The IMO number is a unique identifier for a ship. And a ship from the shadow fleet takes on this number from the scrape vessel. The scrape vessel had nothing to do with the shadow fleet. So it looks like there's a ship that has, beneficial ownership, that who owns this vessel, that suddenly comes back to life and starts broadcasting again. And that is then what we call a zombie ship. So yeah, there is different, the longer this goes on, the more obviously measures the shadow fleet operators take to not be detected.
Yeah, there's a lot of sophisticated tactics there that you described. And I do love that term, zombie ships. It almost sounds like, like a screenplay coming soon to a streaming service near you, zombie ships.
Yeah, I'd watch it.
I would too. So now that we've set the scene for our listeners, how did we approach this report, Ines? How did we pull together this picture of the shadow fleet?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we selected the ships based on criteria around the operations profile. So as I said, that we know that they're involved in trading oil illegally, and then ownership as well. Do we even know who the owner is? That is the main question, the main criteria. And then we filtered those vessels by tiers. So for tier 1, that includes, as I said, the sanctioned tankers. That is in relation to Russia, Iran, or Venezuela. All of these countries face sanctions or have faced sanctions for some years. So these vessels have been sanctioned by the US Office for Asset Control and other sanction authorities, also such as the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the UN, the EU and Switzerland. So those are the main sanction authorities. Tier 2 comprises vessels with an opaque ownership. For us, that is where we can't determine the beneficial owner of a ship. So for us, it is always important to kind of follow the money. There's a registered owner for a ship, but these are often brass plate companies. What we really want to know is who really sits behind that on the financial side. But also vessels that were previously owned by a Russian, Iranian, or Venezuelan nationality or registration. And then tier 3 has more legitimate owners. So the beneficial owners, for example, are more known. Registered owners, those firms have been set prior to 2022. So we know that they have been around for a while. They have not been set up solely for the purpose for a vessel to basically go into this shadow trade. However, those vessels are then engaged in, for example, Russian port calls. That is always something to monitor as well. Obviously, it's an easy indicator, but also these ship-to-ship transfers, where the oil gets transferred from a sanctioned ship to a more legitimate ship after the 5th of December, after the G7 oil cap.
Right. And what were the main findings of the report?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't a data company. If I wasn't going to throw some stats at you, so the shadow fleet increased from 2024 by 45%. So that is quite an increase that we now have, because mainly the increase we see in the tier 3 vessels that are now more than 2,000 vessels. So that is not the shadow fleet. Again, the shadow fleet we say is 940 vessels. So there's basically tier 1 and tier 2. But if you also consider the ship-to-ship transfers, that has increased, and that makes up this big increase of 45% compared to the 2024 iteration of this white paper that my colleagues already did last year. The shadow fleet constitutes of 17% of the in-service crude and product tankers that are on the water today. So that is quite a bit, but again, this only takes into consideration vessels that are above 27,000 deadweight. So the percentage might be a bit higher there, but yeah, 17% of the total tanker crude and product fleet. And then to do more with the vessel characteristics, the average age of a shadow fleet vessel is 20 years. That is quite high. Normally, a ship operates up to maybe 20-25 years. Obviously, it depends on demand and capacity. So take it, the average size of a tanker with a 27,000 deadweight and above is 13 years. So that's quite a difference to the shadow fleet tankers' average age of 20 years. And then another interesting stat that we found is that 48% of all in-service crude and product tankers have engaged in the shipment of Russian oil. So that is nearly half of all the in-service tankers have shipped oil since the 5th of December 2022.
Wow, thanks for those stats. We do love stats here at the Decisive, and there's some big ones there. That 48% is pretty impressive. And also the average age of the shadow fleet vessels, very interesting stuff there. Ines, how have recent sanctions against Russia, Iran, and Venezuela affected the operations of the shadow fleet? Can you share some specific examples with us of enforcement actions that have been taken?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's taken some time until governments came up with a plan on how to counter these developments. But this year, especially, has seen countries in Europe take action. Because what happens? Because obviously, we've seen before, okay, the ships are not allowed to call at European ports anymore, but of course they are still going through European waters. But obviously governments can only act if a ship comes into their national water. So that's what we've seen, that this is basically happening now, because we're not aware of any non-port state control. So this is just where a vessel gets inspected when during a port call detentions in the Baltic Sea prior to December 2024. But now we've seen, I think the most prominent case was earlier in May in Estonia, when the Estonian Navy wanted to detain a crude oil tanker that was then escorted by a Russian fighter jet that then breached into Estonian airspace. So a crude oil tanker that was then escorted by a Russian fighter jet that broke into Estonian airspace and was then escorted into Russian waters. This followed the Russian Parliamentary Defense Committee's plan that they set out earlier in February this year, that any attack of Russian-linked oil exporting carriers, including foreign-flagged vessels in the Baltic Sea, would be regarded as an attack on Russian territory. So clearly we see an escalation here on both sides, on the enforcement side, but also on Russia responding to these enforcement actions. This marked the fourth detention operation against a shadow fleet vessel in the Baltic Sea region since December 2024. The 3 previous operations were conducted by Finland, Germany, and again Estonia, and they resulted then in maritime authorities successfully diverting the vessels into national waters, detaining a vessel, and also in the case in Germany, confiscating the cargo. So that is where we see the development of enforcement action. The next step for the Baltic state governments will be that they are in the process of drafting legislation permitting these vessel seizures and enabling arrests in more distant maritime zones, because again, government can only be active if a ship comes out of the international shipping channel and comes within these 12 nautical miles. That then includes the national waters of a country.
Very interesting that these enforcement actions are ticking up. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves as the year goes on. And as what trends have you observed in the transportation of Russian, Iranian, and Venezuelan oil over the past year? How has the shadow fleet adapted to these changes?
Yeah, I think what unfortunately we see is that how ineffective these sanctions are, right? Russia is still able to trade oil, but of course with new partners. As we know, the supply chain, in any case for any product adapts. And instead, what we've now seen is that these old vessels traverse the oceans. So, and, unfortunately, this is an outcome of these sanctions being imposed. However, what we also most recently see is that the Brent oil price is now under the G7 cap of $60 per barrel. So that means that, for example, Greek tanker owners will be returning to ship Russian oil as they won't face any restrictions or will be accused of sanction evasion. And those vessels are much better maintained than the shadow fleet. So this might be, another change we will see happen when maybe, is a way out of the increase of ships joining the shadow fleet if more legitimate vessels come to transport Russian oil. Because obviously it's not completely impossible for Russia to export oil. It's just because of the price cap, of course, that they try to get exports out above the price cap.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it leads me to my next question, which is, who are the benefactors of the G7 oil price cap, if there are any?
Yeah, definitely. There's always someone that manages to make some money out of a situation. I mentioned AIS earlier, the way to track vessels at sea. These shadow fleet tankers, 80% of the time they turn the AIS off, but the 20% where these ships do transmit a location, they obviously enable us to form a picture of where those ships trade. And of course, also, if you turn the AIS off, just a little side note, and then, weeks later, you turn on your AIS again and you're in a different location than where you turned your AIS off, of course, there is algorithms that will be able to calculate where a ship could have been in the meantime. And of course, our CWEB and Maritime Intelligence Risk Suite products show the calculations for you. What we can see is that these focus areas are the Fujairah oil terminal in the UAE, the Malacca Strait, east of Singapore, as well as fishing grounds in the Arabian Sea between India and the Middle East. So a lot of the Russian oil that's no longer going to Europe has instead gone to India and to mainland China because they're traversing these waters that I've just mentioned. We also know this from looking at our Panjiva or Global Trade Atlas products that show us import and export statistics as well as shipment data. So combining these sources, we get quite a good overview of where this oil flows.
Now, given the average age of the vessels that you mentioned earlier, Ines, I imagine there are safety issues involved in the shadow fleet as well. And this was something you wrote about in your report on fraudulent flags, which is available on our website. What can you tell us about safety concerns?
Yes, that is a very important point. Again, the ships are old. The average age of the shadow fleet tankers is 20 years compared to the 13 years of the other tankers in service. Those ships, so that is obviously a maintenance issue because, as we all know, when you get older, you have more issues. Same thing for a ship that you need to take care of. And if you don't do that, then that will have consequences, breakdowns of engines. There might be oil spills from that ship. So there might be different issues that could occur from mechanical failures of a ship. On the admin side, the ships are often not insured. If an incident happens where, we have an oil spill, if a ship breaks down, then who's going to pay for that? And the issue is you will have a very hard time getting a salvage team out to help one of those ships if they don't know who will reimburse them for their efforts, for sending out the vessel, for cleaning up the oil. So that is obviously an issue for the environment. Normally what happens to avoid all of this, what happens in the shipping industry is, I mentioned this earlier, are port stay controls, where a ship goes when it does a port call, a ship gets inspected to see if it's fit to go and trade in international waters. Same to, a car MOT in the UK, basically, where you get your car checked to make sure it's road worthy. And these ships, because they don't call at ports, they're not allowed to call at European ports, but they also obviously avoid to port calls because they want to avoid these inspections as well. So their safety record, therefore, can't be verified. And what you also need to consider is that there are people on board. There is a crew on board. And there's obviously a big issue when the crew doesn't choose. Often crews are not able to choose what ships they will sail on. And they also, they will not go around the engine room before they leave with a vessel, so to check if the vessel is seaworthy. So they are then exposed to all these dangers and potential incidents that I just mentioned. The shadow fleet also poses a risk to the oceans as well. You also want me to tell you something about fraudulent flags as well. That comes into the administrative side of a ship. So what happens is shipping ownership is very layered. We have this beneficial owner, we have this registered owner, we have someone who operates the vessel, and then we have a place where a ship is registered. That doesn't have to be a place where the owner lives or has is registered as domiciled. But you can choose to register your vessel in a different country. And we have seen something that, again, interesting term, flags of convenience, where you can register a vessel more cheaply. However, these flags are still safe. When a ship is registered with one of those flags, it still will get inspected. It will be checked that there is an owner behind these ships. What we see with the fraudulent flags is that a ship used to be registered with a flag. However, it was deleted from that flag. And it continues to, for example, broadcast on AIS that is still registered with that flag. But it turns out it has no flag register. But having a flag register is mandatory if you operate a vessel in international waters. So obviously, again, the shadow fleet tankers not wanting to be detected, they will not be able, and because a lot of these vessels are sanctioned, they will not go to a flag state and try and register with a new flag state. Instead, they are just continuing to use an old flag state. And we have seen a massive increase of these cases. And because of the work that we do on behalf of the International Maritime Organization, where we issue the so-called IMO numbers, these identifiers for ships, as well as companies, we then also receive documents from a ship owner to say what flag state a vessel is registered with. And we then see that these certificates from a flag state, for example, say provisional, and we have a few certain flags where we know that they are fraudulent, where we've seen a massive increase of these registrations pop up. And then on the other hand, and this is also somewhat the background for why the Estonian Navy wanted to detain the tanker, was that vessel had no registered flag state attached to it at all, which is illegal according to the IMO regulations.
So based on your analysis, Ines, what do you foresee as the future of the shadow fleet? Are there any emerging risks or trends that companies should be aware of?
There are always new business opportunities that also come up, right? In what we now see, where the oil price is below the price cap, we see the emergence of, for example, undersea cables being damaged by these shadow fleet tankers. So they might not longer be out there to transport oil. They might be out there to damage infrastructure that is undersea instead. Russia, for example, uses research vessels for that. And of course, that then means they also come across undersea cables when doing this. So there is a somewhat dual use for this as well. But these incidents of undersea cables being damaged is something that also has led some of especially of the Baltic states, governments to try and detain vessels, because there have been a few incidents in the Baltic Sea of undersea cables being cut as well.
All right. Well, I'm sure we could go on, but it's time to wrap up our discussion. Ines, what would you say are the biggest challenges facing sanctions compliance teams in the maritime industry today, and how can they address these challenges effectively?
Yeah, so I think knowing who you deal with is important. We have a comprehensive database showing who beneficially owns a vessel in the maritime sphere, of course. That is what was important, and also what condition that vessel is in. I've mentioned, the age, the maintenance. We can even look at when the ship goes into dry dock, which is, again, something that has to do with maintenance of a ship. And I think I want to just reiterate that I've got to remember that people are on these ships. Crew abandonment cases have quadrupled since 2019. And alone this year, we've seen an increase of cases again. What happens when crew gets abandoned is that a ship operator, when a ship gets detained, just decides that it is not worth their money to get the ship out of that detention, basically. So they just abandon it, and they abandon it with the crew on board. That sometimes lead to the crew having to stay on board for years. And because the country that they are in might not issue them a visa, they are not allowed to leave the ship. So they are trapped on a ship without an employer that is responsible for repatriating them back home. I think another important, interesting development in this kind of context is there are more and more products being considered dual use or that face export controls, especially for mainland China. That is for two reasons. Obviously, of course, first, the Ukraine-Russia war breaking out, but now also following the tariff escalations that we see from the US administration. And the latter in itself is a big issue for anyone involved in a company supply chain, and not just sanctions. So that is a topic that will, I think, keep us all busy this year. I think the best advice is to come to us, come to S&P Global, discuss how we can help. I think we have a solution for any of your maritime and logistics problems.
All right. That's a good note to end it on. Thank you so much, Ines, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. That wraps up this episode of the Decisive Podcast. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.